Our lecture topic for today is a brief history of China. We're headed to Korea and Japan. Why in the world are we talking about China? Well, we obviously left China 2 days ago because either if you were one of the people that was continuing on from the previous cruise, we went up the coast of China. But all of you that boarded in Beijing obviously experienced China. But there's a particular reason why, prior to us getting to Japan, I've got a couple of lectures about China, and that is that China, having been the power and the most important not only political but cultural presence in East Asia for a very long time, much of what happened in Korea and in Japan only really makes sense if you have some kind of understanding of the history of China. So this is all kind of a preview in terms of historically and socially of the things that we're going to be talking about as we go along and the things that you will be seeing when we are in South Korea and Japan. So our lectures, again, this morning, a brief history of China. This afternoon, partly because it affected the rest of East Asia, but also because it's just interesting. It gives you an understanding of how all of East Asia related to Western powers. We'll be talking about the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. I think yesterday I asked if people remember the Charlton Heston movie, 55 Days in Peking. That was about the Boxer Rebellion. So we'll talk about that. Then we will have 2 lectures on Korea. We'll talk about a brief history of Korea and then the Forgotten War, the Korean conflict. And I'm not the one that called it the Forgotten War. It's been called that. Officially, the Korean War was not a war because it was never declared and it never ended. There was an armistice, but there was not a peace treaty. So technically, North and South Korea are still at war with one another. So we'll talk about all of that. Then we get into start visiting other areas of Japan. We'll talk about the birth of the atomic age, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A brief history of Japan called Emperors and Shoguns, Religions of Japan. And we'll talk about the beautiful Japanese gardens, Islands of Tranquility. This is before we get to Osaka and you have the opportunity to visit Kyoto, but you'll be seeing gardens all along the way. They're one of the real trademarks of the Japanese culture. Samurai and the Code of Bushido, the Japanese art and architecture, and then we will talk about the Pacific War, particularly some of the key battles, the turning points in the Pacific War that led up to the end of the war in 1945. So that's where we're going with this, and hopefully you understand a little bit more about why we're talking about China here up front. China is considered one of the 4 cradles of humanity, the places where civilization began. What I mean by that is the places, civilization is usually characterized as the beginning of cities, because cities meant there was a stable or settled agricultural system, but also that they were building as well, that they have formal buildings. The parts of the world that are considered the 4 the cradles of civilization, first the Mesopotamian area, which are the rivers of between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Mesopotamia literally means land between the rivers. So that's considered probably the earliest of human civilization. We then have, of course, Egypt and the Nile River. Then only in the last century have we discovered the scope of the Indus Valley civilization, or Harappan civilization it's sometimes called. This is the Indus River Valley in India, Pakistan. And again, we didn't even know about this until a little over 100 years ago. And the more they learn about it, the more they realize how early it began and how significant it is. If you ever go on the Windstar Cruises in the around India and that part of South Asia, I've lectured on those, and those videos are available at our website, which I'll be giving to you later on in the cruise. And then there is obviously China. At first, for many years, they thought that the earliest human civilization in China was just on the Huanghe River, which is the Yellow River. That's what we usually call it. And now they've discovered, though, that there's a lot of early evidence for civilization on the Yangtze rivers as well. The 2 major rivers. The Yellow River here, it makes this big northern horseshoe, and then comes out into the Yellow Sea, and then you have the Yangtze River here, the 2 major rivers. You'll notice all of these civilizations, early civilizations, were on river valleys because the availability of fresh water was critical to not only drinking, but also the irrigation, agriculture, and everything else. So these are the 4 cradles of civilization. In terms of China, We have evidence of millet agriculture, meaning a stable, people had to be able to stay in one place in order to have steady agriculture rather than being nomadic herdsmen. So millet agriculture we have as early in China as 7000 BC. The earliest writing we have on cliff faces is about 6000 BC. By 5000 BC, we have evidence of other organized agriculture, of formalized buildings, and usually that means either palaces for rulers or temples of some kind. There's ceramics coming into play in around 5000 BC, and also burial rituals. One of the signs of civilization is that people develop very formalized ways of dealing with the dead, and including leaving artifacts in tombs and things of that sort. Then the first written records we have in China are about 1500 or so BC. And then in the 6th century BC, we have evidence of metallurgy, where they are actually blending metals in order to be more effective in what they prepared. Now, the handout that I gave you, I'll give you a few minutes to memorize this. This actually is an astonishing chart because it covers 4,000 years of Chinese history. In fact, I need to apologize right up front because I'm going to give you 4,000 years of history in the next 43 minutes or so, and which means I'm going to have to just rip through it, and you can pick up what you can, but this chart will allow you to go back and refer to it, starting with the very earliest dynasty of Chinese history, which is the Xia, and then Shang, Zhou, Qin, and you just follow this chart around to the Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty of China, the Republic of China, and then the People's Republic of China. Yes?
Is there a handout?
There is, sorry. Anyone else not get this? Okay. There you are, I think there's two there. I think there's two right there. Do you have an extra one there? I think that's two. Okay, great. Here, I'll let you guys divide those up. Thank you. So, and if you didn't get one, I'll make some more copies because I think that's all I have right now. But we'll go through this and talk about each of these dynasties, some in considerable detail, and some of them I'll give you one sentence, and then we'll move on, because obviously some of the dynasties were more important than others. In fact, we start with the first three. The earliest of the Chinese dynasties are the Xia dynasty, which is X-I-A. Anytime you see an X, it usually is pronounced like S-H. J-H is pronounced ZH is pronounced like J. So this is the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties. You can see, it's difficult to see the color difference. The red here was the Xia dynasty. There's a blue area right along here that was the Shang dynasty, and then the larger green area is the Zhou dynasty. The Xia dynasty, we have no archaeological evidence of that dynasty existing, and there's some scholars that have doubted it ever really was. But we do have three of the oldest of the historical records from China, which are in the Zhou dynasty, 2 dynasties later. They refer to the Xia dynasty as being the first one. But we have no written record on any permanent, see, if they wrote on something that was organic, like papyrus or something of that sort, none of that stuff lasted. It's very rare that we have ancient papyrus documents, and only from areas of the desert, like from the Middle East and places like that, where it was dry and they wouldn't rot. But we don't have any archaeological evidence, but we do have written records. Some people have proposed that since it was the Zhou dynasty period that produced those histories, that the Zhou dynasty may have made up the Xia dynasty and said that the Shang conquered them in order to justify them having conquered the Shang dynasty. But we don't know that for sure, so there's still some question about it. The Xia dynasty was roughly 2070 to 1600 BC. The Shang dynasty, which came next, is the first dynasty that we have any clear archaeological evidence for. They have uncovered 11 royal tombs, and in those tombs they have found various weapons, artifacts, and other pieces of material that tells us that they had royal burials then, including clear evidence of both animal and human sacrifice back in the Shang dynasty. But particularly, starting in the Shang dynasty, we have tortoise shells. They discovered back in the 1800s that some of the herbalists and Chinese medicine people were grinding up these ancient bones or tortoise shells. This is called a plastron, which is the lower shell of a turtle. because they had writing on them and they were considered to have medicinal properties. So they would grind them into powders and put them in medicines. Well, when they discovered that, various archaeologists and sociologists began to study these things and to realize these were the oldest written records that we have from China, from the Qing Dynasty. They're called oracle bones, and they're usually either the shell of a tortoise, like this is the lower shell, the plastron, or they are ox shoulder blades, the biggest bones that they could get. And what they would do is they would, using a scratching tool, they would scratch a question, and so we know they had script back then, related to, is my crop going to succeed this year? Or, is my child going to be a boy? Then they would drill a hole next to that question, and they would heat the bone or the shell, and that would cause it to crack. And they would have shamans who would interpret the cracks and come up with an explanation for what the answer, according to the divinities, was. And sometimes if they didn't like the answer, they'd ask the question again and keep going until they got what they wanted. But because they would use these shells or ox shoulder blades over and over again, we have some of them that are covered with these inscriptions. And because of the nature of the questions, we learned a lot about the culture, various aspects of the society, the religion, the economy, the political system. They currently have found over 100,000 of these things, because that was how they communicated with the gods back then. So these oracle bones were critically important. Then the Qing Dynasty fell to the Zhou Dynasty about 1046 BC, and so you'll notice that starting with the Shah, we got about 4,000 years of history here. But the Zhou Dynasty in 1046 took over from the Shang, and they lasted, it was the longest dynasty in Chinese history up until 221 BC. They introduced, in the Zhou Dynasty, they introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven. Roughly speaking, it's sort of like the divine right of kings in Europe, where God had, in Europe they said God decided who was going to be king. This wasn't quite the same, because they didn't say God did it. When they talk about the mandate of heaven, it means the whole of the spiritual realm supported the rule of a particular king, or later on emperor. They weren't called emperors at this point. The next group we'll talk about is the First Empire. But the idea that they were supported by the spiritual realm, the mandate of heaven. And this mandate of heaven kind of idea was a little bit self-fulfilling prophecy, because then if they got defeated by somebody else, then clearly the mandate of heaven was for that person who won to be the new ruler. And so, but this was how they pretty much ran things. Towards the end of the Zhou period, we have two important historical periods. One is called the Spring and Autumn period. Okay, it's not just me. The lights are really flickering on and off, right? I was beginning to wonder. So toward the end of the Zhou period, the Spring and Autumn period was a time of real upheaval. It's called that because later on a history of this period was called the Spring and Autumn Annals. And so they call that period after the history written about it. And then that led into the Warring States period, where there really was conflict, and the Zhou Dynasty broke apart. But the Zhou Dynasty was important because not only did they come up with a refined Chinese script, a form of writing, but they also really, this was one of the high points of metallurgy and the developing of bronze bells and that sort of thing. The first imperial dynasty in China was the Qin Dynasty, Q-I-N. Q is usually pronounced like C-H. So the Qin Dynasty. In fact, the Qin Dynasty gave its name to modern China, because this is the first time that someone declared themselves emperor. The Qin emperor, who called himself Qin Shi Huangdi, which means first emperor of the Qin, and he expected his empire would last for many, many generations. It only lasted 15 years, as it turns out. But it was very important because under the Qin ruler, Shi Huangdi, they created a standardized currency, weights and measures, standardized writing system. They standardized all the road systems. He conquered the other 6 of the warring states. There had been 7, but Qin defeated all the others, brought them into one unity, and then at that point, he's responsible for taking sections of defensive walls that the other warring states had built and connecting them all together into the Long Wall. This is the first evidence of what we would think of as the Great Wall, although there were walls earlier than this. This is the beginning of the Great Wall. He created a model for government bureaucracy that lasted for most of the imperial history of China, where they would give exams for men to take, and if they passed those exams, then they were eligible for taking a part in the government. I wish you would stop doing that. We'll see. Now, Shi Huangdi ruled by a pretty rigid system, a philosophical system called legalism. The principle was pretty simple. You set down strict laws, you make sure everybody's aware of the law, you apply it fairly, even against high-level people. In fact, some of the people that instituted legalism ended up violating some of the laws and were executed for it, because you apply it fairly, and the penalties are severe. It always reminded me, George Bernard Shaw said he knew how to stop all crime in society. That the first crime that somebody committed, no matter what it was, you let them go. And the second crime they committed, no matter what it was, you executed them. He said you'd have a massive amount of crime for about 2 weeks, and then no problem. Well, that's sort of the way that Shi Huangdi thought of it, is you have clear rules, anybody that breaks them, you know. So because of that, and because he also, he did a lot of building of various things, it was Shi Huangdi that created a city-sized mausoleum, including the terracotta warrior army. He had this fascination for eternal life. He wanted to live forever, and so he built this massive mausoleum with an army of terracotta warriors that he thought would protect him in the afterlife. And he had his various shamans and wise men always trying to come up with some elixir to give him eternal life. He died at 49 because some of his wise men gave him things to consume to give him eternal life that included mercury, and he died of mercury poisoning because he was trying to live forever. But he was the first Chinese emperor, and even though it's one of the shortest lived of the major dynasties, only 15 years, he established it as an imperial rule, and he created a lot of the standards that continued into the future. And as I say, he gave the name China from Qin that we use today. This is the Qing Dynasty, the pink area here. The outline up here is modern day China. So this was the largest area that anyone had controlled at that point. And you see the Great Wall, the Long Wall, as they called it then, that he was responsible for. Later on, it stretches up to the northwest because they used it to protect some of the Silk Road, which we'll mention in just a moment. So that was the Qing Dynasty. The next, which is one of the greatest and most important of all the dynasties, was the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, let me flip over my notes here. The Han Dynasty comes along, takes over from the Qin, and greatly expands the territory through military conquest. The Han Dynasty lasted about 400 years, a little over 400 years, from 206 BC to 220 AD. It's considered the golden age of Chinese history. Even today, the majority of Chinese, ethnic Chinese, identify themselves as Han Chinese after this empire. The Chinese script are called Han characters because this dynasty made such an impact, a time of economic prosperity, significant advances in science, in technology, in mathematics. They developed the concept of negative numbers in China at that time, which for theoretical mathematics is absolutely necessary. They also, in terms of, they developed paper making at this time in a very sophisticated level. Ship design and building really advanced. For instance, they invented, during the Han Dynasty, ship's rudders that would allow them to have large ships that would travel the seas. There were a number of major conflicts that the Han had to deal with, especially with nomadic tribes from the north that were sort of Mongol-based tribes, most particularly the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a tribe that were disparate tribes, all part of one people, but when finally they got a leader that called them all together, they challenged Han China to the extent that at one point the Han had to agree to be equal partners with the Xiongnu, which were nomadic tribes people. And the Han were never happy about that, but they had to deal with that. It's believed that the Xiongnu, by some scholars, that the Xiongnu later became the Huns, Attila the Hun. They moved further west, they moved into first Central Asia, and then Eastern Europe, and then Central Europe, and the Huns ended up later on giving the name to Hungary. And so they believe, some scholars believe, that those original Xiongnu Mongol nomads had become the Huns eventually. Now, one of the most important things about the Han Dynasty was they developed what became known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not one road, it was a series of trade routes that allowed Han China to trade all the way to the Roman Empire. Prior to the Han Dynasty, China did not know what lay to the west. The furthest that they got, there's an area called the Tarim Basin, the Taklamakan Desert, and that was as far as anybody had traveled. I mentioned that the Xiongnu, these Mongol nomads, were being such a problem to the Han. Well, previously there had been a very powerful group called the Weizi. The Xiongnu, when they got all their tribes working together, they defeated the Weizi and drove them west, and they had been very powerful before. The Weizi had 200,000 mounted warriors. Well, the Han decided to send somebody to look for the Weizi and ask them to come back so that the Weizi and the Han together could defeat the Xiongnu and get rid of their mutual enemy. Well, the Weizi didn't come back, but the man that they sent after them, his name was Jiang Qian. Jiang Qian traveled to the west. He ended up actually, this Longchang, you see Xiongnu here, Longchang was the capital of the Xiongnu Empire, and he got captured for 10 years. And they treated him well. He got married, had children, but after 10 years he said, I wonder what's happening back home. And so for the first time ever, he returned, when he returned, the first time ever, they got reliable reports of what it was that lay to the west. Because he had traveled all the way over past the Tarim Basin, the Pamir Mountains, up to Fergana, which was known for its very powerful horses. The Chinese were crazy about getting more powerful horses because their horses were not very strong. Apparently there's not enough potassium and other minerals in the grass that grows in China to raise strong horses. But the nomads in the north and in the northwest, Fergana, had very powerful horses. In fact, they were thought to be bred by dragons. They were called the heavenly horses of Fergana, sired by dragons. And so the Chinese really wanted that. When Jiang Qian finally came back and told them that Chang'an was the capital at that point, and Chang'an during this period of time was the most populous city in the world. The Han were very, very significant. They began to send others further west and began to develop trade. Jiang Qian even had found out about this huge empire that was further to the west, which turned out to be Rome. And so eventually they developed trade routes from China. This is what it looked like, that went around the Tarim Basin, the Taklamakan Desert, either north or south, or a northern route, all the way over to Byzantium, Constantinople, now Istanbul, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and from there trade all the way over to Rome. So that they were traveling all the way to literally Britain from there. It ended up becoming not only land routes but sea routes. It was called the Silk Road in the 19th century by a German geographer who was an expert on Chinese and Asian geography named Ferdinand von Richthofen. You recognize that name. He was the uncle of the famous Baron von Richthofen of the First World War German ace. So these roads it's been called the most significant development in all of human cultural history, because this connected the East with the West, and it was a way to transmit not only product. It's called the Silk Road because the silks that they had from China, as well as ceramics, spices, other things, that went west, and from there they got other kinds of spices and woolen materials and metal, all kinds of things, glasswork and wine from Rome. All of this stuff is traveling back and forth, but even more important, these became the routes by which human culture was transferred. Various ideas, philosophies, and religions. Buddhism, which started in India, traveled to the east and became part of China, Korea, and Buddhist beliefs. Taoism from China moved to the west. Nestorian, a particular kind of Christianity that had been declared a heresy by the Roman Catholic Church, ended up traveling to the east. And so you had this massive interplay of culture, not just the transfer of goods along those lines. Well, after the Han Dynasty, it's fairly this is a generality, but it's fairly common to say that Chinese history went from a very stable period to a very rocky, violent period, to a stable period, to a violent period, to a stable period. It was this sort of roller coaster throughout their history. After the stability, golden age of the Han, we have a period called the Three Kingdoms, in which three different kingdoms, the Wu, the Wei, and the Shu Han, all claim to be the heirs of the Han Empire, and all three of their rulers claim to be the emperor. Well, eventually Wu conquered Wei, and then the new Jin dynasty comes along and conquers both Wu and Wei, and they set up a new dynasty. But this period of time, the Three Kingdoms, is probably the bloodiest period in all of Chinese history. A survey that was done prior to this, in the Han period, identified that within this area there were 16.2 million households and 56.5 million people. After the Three Kingdoms period, they did another census and identified 2.5 million households and 10.7 million people. So it went from 56.5 million people to 10.7 million people. 80% of the population were killed during this period of time. And not just from direct warfare, but from famine and various other things that are the direct result of wartime. Now, despite that, there were considerable advances during the Three Kingdoms period. Development of hydraulics, development of what they call the wooden ox. Can you imagine what that is? A wheelbarrow. Now, you may not think much of wheelbarrows, but think about what a difference it makes if you have to move a large pile of dirt or manure from one place to another. So a wheelbarrow was a huge thing. They developed irrigation and a kind of non-magnetic compass so that they could determine direction. After the Three Kingdoms, we have the Qing Dynasty that controlled the three of those and regained some of the territory that Han had up in the northwest. This time, again, a lot of upheaval still. It's a period where the Five Barbarians, invasion of barbarian peoples into China. They had what they call the 16 Kingdoms period at the end of the Qing Dynasty, which meant that it was breaking up into all these tiny kingdoms. But even then, they had inventions in technology. For instance, it was during this period of time that they invented the stirrup. Now imagine what a difference it would make if you're riding a horse, particularly if you're riding a horse in battle, to have a stirrup or not have a stirrup. You know, it was enormously more efficient for the mounted military, and almost everybody, because that's how the nomads had taught them to fight, almost everybody fought from horseback. So the stirrup that was developed during the Qing Dynasty was very important. There was then a period called the Northern and Southern Kingdoms period from 420 to 589, and it again was a time of some instability. There was political chaos, but at the same time there was a flourishing of arts, of culture and technology, and most especially the Silk Road had brought Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, into this area, and it was a huge time of growth for Buddhist faith, as well as for Taoism, which was a Chinese religion, but it spread a great deal during that time. We then come to the Sui Dynasty. It was short-lived, only 29 years, but they really developed stability during that time, and so it was very important, a pivotal time. They put in a number of reforms. They developed an equal field system for agriculture where everybody had the opportunity to grow their own crops, and that created a lot more initiative for people to grow. That meant they were growing a lot more rice, and because of that, there's always a direct equation in history between the availability of food and the growth of the population. The population doubled during the Sui Dynasty, from just before the beginning to just after it, because of the availability of more food. They also, again, encouraged Buddhism. They standardized the coinage, the system. They developed the Grand Canal. They built the Grand Canal, which allowed them to move grain and other products within China so that they didn't have to travel overland. They could do it by sea. But the Sui Dynasty was short-lived because to do all the projects that they were doing, like the Grand Canal, they taxed people heavily. They forced labor. You know, people were forced to do conscripted labor. And eventually, the Sui Dynasty tried several times to invade Korea, the Three Kingdoms of Korea, and failed each time. And so there was a revolt, and they threw them out. We come to the Tang Dynasty, which, other than the Han and maybe the Ming, is one of the most important dynasties in history. You'll notice the size. They have recovered almost all of what had been the Han Dynasty, including this area over in the northwest, which was key to the Silk Road routes. This was a time of, again, another golden age of civilization for China, a lot of cosmopolitan culture. They had, in the cities, they had a lot of like entertainment quarters in the cities. There was a sense, and again, the Chang'an capital during the Tang period was once again the most populous city in the world. Population had grown to 80 million, which meant the Tang could have an army of hundreds of thousands. The larger the population, the larger army they could have, and that allowed them to regain some of those areas and reestablish some of the Silk Road trade. They became a powerful, during the Tang period, a very powerful cultural influence over Korea and Japan and Vietnam and other areas around. This is, as I started out, I said that knowing something about Chinese history helps you understand something about Korea and Japan, where we're going to be traveling. A lot of technological innovations like woodblock printing, the spread of the Buddhist sects, and so much growth during the Tang, the culture of the Tang. The Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period was a time of great upheaval in the 10th century, and that's all I'm going to say about that. We then come to the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty, from 960 to 1279, they had gained control after the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period, and again, developed a very vibrant social life. There was a lot of artwork, a lot of public festivals, city entertainment quarters were reestablished. They developed an expanded technique in woodblock printing. They developed in the 11th century the movable type. We think of movable type being Gutenberg, in the 16th century in Europe. They developed movable type in the 11th century in China. So they were 500 years ahead of Europe at that point. The Song Dynasty had the first paper money, the first standing Chinese navy, the first known use of gunpowder, black powder, and the first magnetic compass, which was more reliable than anything they'd had before. Again, the population once again doubled in the 10th and 11th century, and it was a very powerful, the Song Dynasty was a very powerful dynasty, but unfortunately, historically, they ran into a major problem, a major hurdle, in the form of Genghis Khan and his descendants. The 13th century was when Genghis Khan, you may know the name Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is the more correct pronunciation. And side note, if you wonder why it used to be Mao Zedong and now it's Mao Zedong, why it used to be Beiping and now it's Beijing, in the 1950s, they introduced a new way of transliterating Chinese characters into English characters. That means, you just reproduce them in something that we can read. And that was called the pinyin system. Previously, they had used a system developed by the English called the Wade-Giles. Well, the pinyin system is much more accurate in terms of telling you how to pronounce things. And so that's why a lot of the pronunciations have changed since that time. And why we now say Genghis Khan, which is a more appropriate pronunciation, rather than Genghis Khan. So the pinyin system, and you can usually tell the difference because the Wade-Giles system had a lot of apostrophes and hyphens in it, and you don't see as much of that anymore in pinyin. Okay, that's just a side note. So Kublai Khan in 1271 began to conquer down into the Song Dynasty, and Kublai Khan, who's the grandson of Genghis Khan, declared himself the emperor in 1271, and then in 1279, 8 years later, succeeded in conquering all of the Song Dynasty and established the Yuan Dynasty, which was a Mongol dynasty, Mongol rulers. This was what the world looked like. Genghis Khan, his sons and his grandsons, developed the largest contiguous, that is altogether, empire in the history of the world. The only empire that was bigger was the British Empire, and it was, of course, scattered all over, India, Australia, South Africa, everywhere. So the idea of a one contiguous empire, and they did so in very short order, within 2 generations after Genghis Khan. Well, by the time 1294, which was the death of Kublai Khan, there were 4 major kingdoms that had come out of the Mongol Empire. They were the Golden Horde Khanate up in the north, and which led up into the Russian principalities, the Ilkhanate, or subordinate Khanate, down in Persia, Iran, Iraq, and down into India. You had the Chagatai Khanate. One of his sons was named Chagatai, and this was two of his grandsons. The Ilkhanate was his oldest son, Joki, and then the Khanate of the Great Khan, because Kublai Khan, a grandson, was named the Great Khan. One of them would always be established as being the premier that the others were supposed to be secondary to, although that didn't always work out. And Kublai Khan became the Great Khan, and he controlled all of China and Tibet, all of this area. This was, rather than establish it as a Mongol empire, however, Kublai Khan established it as a Chinese-style empire, which he called the Yuan Empire, which was controlled by the Mongolian people, 1279 to 1368. Now, for all of the control, all of the militarism of the Genghis Khan, his sons and grandsons, this was a time Kublai Khan loved beauty and art and pleasure, and he really promoted that. I mean, in Xanadu did Kublai Khan a pleasure palace, you know all of that. Well, that's Kublai Khan. This was the period in which Marco Polo went to China, and the Kublai Khan was the emperor of China at that point. And so the stories that came back about the extraordinary riches and the beautiful palaces and all of that was under the Mongol rulers of the Han Dynasty. One of the other most significant dynasties is the Ming Dynasty. How many of you all went to the Great Wall or have been to the Great Wall? Almost invariably, what you saw, well, let me ask, what you saw was stone, right? Stone blocks built the wall, 39 feet wide in places with parapets and all of that. All of that was built by the Ming Dynasty. Even though the Qing Dynasty, the first imperial dynasty, began the Long Wall, and parts of it had been built earlier, most of that is gone now because it was made out of packed earth between rough, piled stone walls. It was an effective barrier, but it's not, was not able to last forever. The stone walls you saw were built by the Ming Dynasty because they really got after it and built this. The Ming Dynasty has been called one of the greatest eras of orderly government and social stability in history. Lasted 276 years. It was the last imperial dynasty of China that was ruled by ethnic Chinese. Before them, it was the Mongols. After them, the Qing Dynasty, the last one, was ruled by Yurkins, who are Manchus from Manchuria, not ethnic Chinese. The Ming Dynasty had a standing army of over 1 million. They had greatly improved and extended the Great Wall and again, anywhere you go now that you see the stone wall, that's the Ming Wall. The Nanjing shipyards at that time were the largest shipyards in the world, and it was during this time that the treasure ships, how many of you all read 1421, Gavin Menzies' book about the Chinese treasure ships? The treasure ships in the early 1400s were ships, wooden ships, that quite literally were as long as the Star Legend. They were 450 feet long. This ship is 440 feet long. They could carry 2,200 tons of goods. Some of the largest wooden ships ever built, with one exception, I think. And they traveled the world in terms of the Indian Ocean, the South Asian seas, all the way over to the west coast of Africa. Now, Gavin Menzies, in his book 1421, claims they discovered America, and that they also discovered Australia and the North Pole and South Pole. And I do a talk on the treasure ships, which I'm not going to be doing on this tour, but if anyone wants to talk to me about it, I'll be happy to sit and talk with you. But they built these extraordinary ships. This was during a time when there was an increase in trade with Western powers. There were a lot of new products coming in, a great deal of silver, because the Chinese primarily, as we'll talk about this afternoon, required silver in order to trade for goods from the West. Unfortunately, toward the end of the Ming Dynasty, there was what they call a little ice age, where there was a significant drop in temperature, which affected the growth of various crops. With less food, they had a drop in population. They also had a period of floods and epidemics, and that led to the fall or collapse of the Ming and the introduction of the last of the dynasties, which is the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1912. The Qing, again, were not ethnic Chinese. They were Yurkins or Manchus The Manchus came from Manchuria up in here, which was part of China, but it was a different ethnic group. This was a very difficult period, the 100 years of embarrassment, they sometimes call it, the last 100 years, because China lost 2 wars, the Opium Wars that I'll talk about this afternoon, to Britain. They were defeated in a war by the Chinese in 1895, the first Sino-Japanese War that I talked about yesterday. In 1900-1901, the Boxer Rebellion led to 8 Western powers, well, including Japan as one of those, coming into their country and taking control of parts of it. And the weakness and the inability of the imperial court to be able to control any of that or to change and modernize led to a rebellion primarily by intellectuals, young military, and students, and that led to what's called the Xinhai Rebellion or Revolution. And the final emperor, Pu Yi, stepped down in February of 1912, and that was the end of the imperial dynasty and the introduction of the Republic of China. The Republic of China in 1912, there had been a sort of revolutionary voice of a man named Sun Yat-sen, and because he had really advocated for the removal of the emperor and the establishment of a republic like the Western powers had, he became president, but only for a short time. He was forced to cede power to a man who had been the prime minister of the Qing Empire and was leader of the army, named Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai, in short order, tried to make himself the new emperor, and nobody wanted that, so they got rid of him. During that same period of time, though, he had set up what's called the Beiyang Army, and he had all these military leaders around China. And when he was forced out of power, they all decided they were going to be warlords, and they were going to have their own little area of control. And it became a massive problem. By 1925, Sun Yat-sen had started his own political party, which is called the Kuomintang, or KMT, the Nationalist Party. And the Nationalist Party offered an alternative government. In 1927 and 28, one of the leaders of the Kuomintang, whose name was Chiang Kai-shek, led their army, and he did what's called the Northern Expedition, and he put down all of these warlords that were trying to tear the country back apart, and he established the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, as the government, the federal government of China. Well, whereas Sun Yat-sen had welcomed the communists as part of the Kuomintang when he started it, and he died in the process, which is why Chiang Kai-shek became the leader. Chiang Kai-shek did not trust the communists, did not like them, so he threw them out of the party, out of the Nationalist Party, and he started persecuting them. This is where you get the Long March of the communists, and during the Long March where they traveled, it was about 5,600 miles in a year on foot through rough territory. It became a symbol for their willingness to sacrifice. The Communist Party and the Nationalists started a civil war. And the Civil War lasted from 1930 to 1937, and in 37, because the Japanese had invaded, the Nationalists and the Communists, decided they needed to work together against the Japanese, so they presented a united front, although they kept having battles flare up between them. So from 37 to 45, when the Japanese were defeated, they were fighting together, technically, and then in 45, the Civil War started again, from 45 to 49. Slowly, the Communist Party of China took more and more property. They had gained the hearts of the local people, whereas the federal government under Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, had ruined the economy. They had massive inflation. When they needed more money, they just printed more money, which meant nothing was worth anything anymore. They did not do a good job of relating with the common people, and the communists did. So that on October 1st of 1949, Chairman Mao Zedong, announced from Tiananmen Square the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Right about that time, just a little after, Chiang Kai-shek and 7 million of his followers moved to Taiwan and took over the island of Taiwan and established the Republic of China there. So you have the People's Republic of China, which is communist in the mainland, and the Republic of China, which is nationalist and democratic, although the early versions of it was not very democratic on Taiwan. And then 1958 to 62, Mao launched what was called the Great Leap Forward, in which he wanted to industrialize China. He forced the collectivization of farms, and in doing so, he greatly reduced the availability of food. He forced farmers to take over responsibilities in the industries, like making iron, and they didn't know how, and it was a horrible failure. 45 million people died as a result of the Great Leap Forward, because food production dropped, materials dropped, they didn't have trade because the quality of materials was no good. And then in 66 to 68, the Cultural Revolution, in which they were trying to destroy all of the past history and only look to the future. Taiwan, if you go to Taiwan today, the Palace Museum in Taipei has almost all of the ancient Chinese treasures. Because when Chiang Kai-shek and his people went there, they took all the treasury and they took all of the treasures. All of the art and sculpture and bronze work and all of that. And they say, and probably true, it's a good thing they did, because in the Cultural Revolution, they were destroying all those things in mainland China. And so they were preserved because they had them in Taiwan by that point. In 1972, Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger went and met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and reopened relationships between China and America. And China since then, particularly under the period of, well, there's a couple of people involved in that. They changed the market approach. Deng Xiaoping was primarily responsible for this. But they created what they call market socialism, or socialism with a Chinese brand, which means you now can own private property in China under certain circumstances, although technically the government still controls everything, and they have become an economic power, obviously. They say the second most powerful economy in the world after the US. And so now we have mainland China, which is the People's Republic of China, and you have on Taiwan, the Republic of China. So two Chinas, and that continues to be a controversy. There's always discussion of, both of them claim to be the appropriate heir to the Chinese, the Chinese history, and yet two separate countries. Questions about any of that? I've just given you 4,000 years of history in 47 minutes. I told you I'd do it. Questions? Yes?
Mongolia, is it part of China or Russia, or separate?
Well, Mongolia is its own country right now, although there is an outer Mongolia area that is part of China. And it was that area that many of the Mongolians came from, that, the Xiongnu and others, that created such a problem for the Han Dynasty and some people after that. But Mongolia itself is a separate country right now. It's under the general, it's sort of a tributary state to China, but technically it's independent. But China has taken over, of course, Tibet. And people say, well, what's that all about? In fact, in the last cruise, when we talked about this, somebody said, well, why would they care about a little piece, the little Tibet? Tibet is 1/6 of the whole geography of what's modern China. And Tibet is rich in natural resources. They have oil, they have a lot of other things, and so that's why China is so, they claim that Tibet historically has been part of China, which is true in the ancient past, but the idea of them taking over China and the Dalai Lama having to move to a court in exile in India, much of that is just simply driven by the finances of the thing, the resources that are available. Other questions? Yes?
It's where about on that map the islands that China is building up their base. Be on that map or not?
The islands that China is building up,
It's claiming the areas above the sea and the land in it and areas
Right.
and harbors.
there are several areas that are under dispute that are not on here. There are a lot in the South China Sea down here is where a lot of the conflict is. There have also been conflicts up north of here because Japan starts right here and goes up north, and there have always been conflicts up here on the curtain about some of the areas that are in between Russia and Japan, and there's conflict between Russia and Japan over some of those, and there's conflict with China and Japan, but most of the ones that they're really in conflict over are down in the South China Sea. Yeah, and they're not on here. Yes?
Who are the folks out in the west that China's having a problem with?
The Uyghurs? Yeah, it's pronounced Uyghur. The Uyghurs were a Mongolian people originally. They migrated over in here. The area, well, you'll notice that the vast population, and all of the cities are along the East Coast and the North. You know, Beijing here, Hong Kong down here. What just happened? And Hong Kong here, and then the various other major cities, Nanchang, Shanghai. So over in here, it's not densely populated, and they don't have as much control there. In fact, this has always been a problem. When the Japanese tried to conquer China, there was so much territory out there that they might control the cities, but they couldn't control the countryside. And so the Uyghurs, which is U, it starts with a U, but it's pronounced Uyghur, were a Mongolian people that moved over into that area, and they, as the case, because this is the most populous country in the world. You know, there are more Chinese than any other country. Second is India. But the Chinese people are so diverse that from time to time you'll have groups like the Uyghurs that are a Mongolian people that will try to reclaim their original ethnic heritage. And in doing so, it causes the government of China to fear that they may be trying to declare their independence. And so they tend to be very restrictive on that. And this is true in a number of different areas, but mostly it's in the west. This is the Xinjiang area up here. That is the western. It's what used to be the Tarim Basin. The Gansu corridor led into that. We'll talk about that a little bit later on too. Questions? Other questions? Yes?
Where do you see China going in the future?
Where do I see China going in the future? Probably settling somewhere around Nebraska. No, it's this trip, because we were on the earlier cruise and we started in Hong Kong, we visited Taiwan, but then we went to Shanghai and Qingdao and Beijing. I've been surprised at the level of modernity and sophistication in Shanghai. You know, it's a gorgeous, ultra-modern city, equivalent of any other city I've ever seen. In fact, parts of it reminded us very much of Dubai, where we've been several times. And so clearly, the economy is not just paper numbers. You know, they really are excelling in terms of the economy, etc. They do have some serious problems, though. And we had a Chinese guide on board that talked to us a little bit about that. And he said that in Shanghai, for instance, these enormous office buildings and apartment buildings were only about half occupied because they had built for the future. And there is some concern, and he sort of suggested this, that they may experience it may be a bubble that will burst for them the same way that the savings and loan bubble burst in the United States. And there was a huge economic negative impact. And so that may be coming too. They have other struggles in terms of quality. We've had a lot of difficulties. You know, it seems like everything is made in China, but many of the things made in China, you have to have concerns about. You know, we have dogs that we love very much, and we're careful of what we buy, that we never give them any treats or any food that comes from China, because they have found all sorts of foreign stuff like formica ground up in those things. In fact, a few years ago, the senior government minister that was responsible for quality control and manufacturing was executed because of how badly the quality of products had fallen in China. So they have some serious problems. I believe that my guess is that they will go the way Japan did, and that is that they would have a massive rise in the 70s and 80s especially, and then they sort of plateau. And they're still a major economic force, which China will continue to be, but I don't think they're on this permanent rise that they're going to take over the whole world. You know, I don't think that's going to happen, because they have problems too.
Yeah, but perhaps,
Yes.
perhaps with the latest political development in China,
Yeah.
we might revert to a Han Qing Dynasty now.
Yeah.
We might be seeing the beginnings of something.
Yeah, whenever a ruler declares themselves ruler for life, that's not a good sign in terms of stability, because the ability to turn over government is one of the things that allows for balancing. And when you have someone who has become ruler for life, the tendency is that that's probably going to be inclined toward negative effect in terms of overall in the country. I mean, that's almost always been the case, that it may look great for a while because dictatorship is a very efficient form of government, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the best form of government. So we'll see what happens. I don't feel qualified to make long-term projections. Here and then over here, okay?
Do you know why we're not going to Dalian?
We're not going to Dalian because there's a principle where in international maritime that you cannot go to a certain number of ports in one country without going to another country. It's called coupertage, I think, and it's in order to control trade. For instance, if you, we've been on ships from San Diego, you know, we were living in Seattle. Well, they couldn't land in Seattle because that would be 2 consecutive ports in the United States. They had to go to Vancouver, Canada. And maritime law, and it was put in place in order to keep that from becoming a trade route and sort of controlling domestic trade. So in this case, they had planned to go from Beijing to Dalian, which Dalian is right near Lushan, which is the Port Arthur that I talked about in the the Russo-Japanese War. But they figured out that the law didn't allow them to do that. And so we ended up going to Japan and then back to 2 ports in Korea and then back to Japan. I don't understand the technicalities of it, but I know that that's true. It's been true in the US as well. Over here, yes?
I heard that ethnically, 90% of the Chinese people are Chinese. With all of the other 38, or I forget how many different ethnic minorities are.
Yeah.
What's going to happen with those minorities?
So the question is that the vast majority are ethnic Han, which is considered the basic, Chinese ethnic group, and that's why I mentioned it. The Yuan, Mongols, and the Qing, Manchu, were not ethnic Hans. Those were the last and the third from the last of the empire, the imperial dynasties. The minorities have various, for the most part, Manchus and other of the larger groups are just part of the culture. I don't think there are huge problems with that. The only time they run into problems is like with the Uyghurs and some others when they try to fairly aggressively reestablish their own sense of ethnic identity. China gets nervous about that. But apart from that, the fact that there are 38 or so other minority groups, I don't think that there are huge problems with that. And again, unless they begin to feel like a threat to the government. Otherwise, I don't think there's an issue. Yes?
Didn't one of our guides say that the minorities weren't held to the one-child policy?
Well, that's true. They have different policies for different minorities, and some of the minorities that have been in the decline, the government had made exceptions on the one-child policy for them. There are, in fact, the one-child policy is no longer in effect.
Right.
They've gotten rid of it. You're allowed to have 2 children now, but there were always exceptions. If you were a minority and your population was declining, or if you had a first child who had a disability, or there were other reasons why there were exceptions made to it. But so in that regard, they seem to have given a favor to minorities. Yes.
My feeling was that the Chinese, every time they had a problem with an ethnic minority, Tibet or the Uyghurs, they would just send in a bunch of settlers to overrun the population with.
Well, they have done that. Yeah, the idea that when they had problem with a minority in an area, they would bring in settlers. They would settle it with ethnic Han or whatever, and that would water down the focus. And they have done that in the past.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. Was there someone in the back that raised their hand a moment ago? Yes.
The law of cabotage, LDR, named after John Cabot, the old explorer who did the
Right. Great. Cabotage is named after John Cabot, the explorer. And that's the rule that there's a limit to, how many ports within the same country you can go to and that sort of thing. So, again, I don't understand the maritime law involved in that, but that's why we had to make a change. We were not allowed to go from Beijing to Dalian. Thank you all very much for your willingness to listen to 4,000 years of history. This afternoon at 5 o'clock, we'll talk about the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. Thank you.